My father's new wife insisted I pay rent in high school, until I told her the house belongs to me. I've lived with my dad my whole life. My mom passed away when I was just 4, leaving a void so deep it swallowed the light in our house. Dad did his best to keep things steady, but I always caught glimpses of the cracks. The way he'd stare at Mom's favorite chair or linger a little too long over an old photo album. The house we lived in wasn't just ours. It belonged to my mom's parents. It still had that old, lived-in charm. Creaking wooden floors, floral wallpaper faded with time, and a faint smell of lavender that never seemed to leave. After my grandparents passed, it was just Dad and me rattling around in a space that felt far too big for 2 people. When I turned 14, everything changed. One evening, Dad came home looking nervous. He adjusted his tie, something he only did when he was hiding something, and cleared his throat. "Lila," he said hesitantly, "I want you to meet someone special." The way he said it made my stomach twist. Before I could ask what he meant, the front door creaked open, and in walked Sandra. Tall, blonde, perfectly put together, with an air of confidence that filled the room. Her perfume was strong, too strong, and it clung to the air like a challenge. But I barely noticed her. My attention was immediately drawn to the 2 figures standing behind her. "These are my kids," Sandra said, her voice warm yet sharp, like she was trying too hard. She gestured at them with manicured nails. "This is Caleb, he's in college, and this is Kelsey, she's 16. Caleb barely glanced at me, glued to his phone like it was the most important thing in the world. Kelsey, on the other hand, stared me down with a smirk that sent a chill up my spine. It wasn't a friendly look. It was a warning. Later that evening, while Dad and Sandra chatted in the living room, Kelsey cornered me in the kitchen. "Just because our parents are dating doesn't mean we're sisters," she said, crossing her arms and leaning against the counter. Her tone was dripping with superiority. "We don't have to be friends, either. Let's keep our distance. Okay?" I was too stunned to respond. 6 months later, Dad and Sandra were married, and everything familiar about our house disappeared. Caleb took the guest room, Kelsey moved into the study, and Sandra's things multiplied like weeds. My mom's photos and little trinkets were boxed up and replaced with Sandra's vases, candles, and framed photos of her kids. The bathroom, once mine and Dad's, became a war zone. It was either occupied by Sandra's endless beauty routine or Kelsey's TikTok marathons. I started waking up an hour earlier just to shower before school. But I didn't complain. Not when Dad looked happy for the first time in years. He'd hum while making breakfast, come home early for family dinners, and smile in a way I hadn't seen since Mom died. Then Dad got promoted. "Regional Sales Director," he announced at dinner, grinning ear to ear. Sandra's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Oh, David, that's amazing. We should renovate the kitchen. Maybe get a new car." But I barely heard her. My focus was on one phrase: extensive travel. The reality of those words hit me a week later when Dad left on his first business trip. The second his car disappeared down the street, Sandra's warm smile vanished, replaced by a steely glare. "Lila," she said sharply, "we need to set some ground rules." Her version of rules turned into a never-ending list of chores and restrictions. No study groups, no volleyball practice. "Someone needs to help with dinner," Sandra said flatly. Every day after school, I rushed home to scrub floors, clean windows, and cook, while Kelsey lounged on the couch giggling at her phone. Caleb was barely around, only showing up long enough to leave dirty dishes in the sink. One night, while scrubbing pots in the sink, I couldn't take it anymore. "Why doesn't Kelsey do any of this?" Sandra's head snapped up from her magazine. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Kelsey is focusing on college applications. She doesn't have time for chores." I glanced over at Kelsey, mid-TikTok dance, twirling with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Really? She looks busy." Sandra's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "Enough, Lila. I won't tolerate disrespect." I clenched my jaw, biting back the words threatening to spill out. What was the point of arguing? Dad was gone, and Sandra ruled the house like a queen. The worst part wasn't the chores or Kelsey's laziness. It was the act Sandra put on whenever Dad called. "Oh, honey," she'd sigh dramatically. "You have no idea how hard it's been, managing the house, taking care of everything on my own." And Dad? He'd fall for it every time. Clueless, he'd kiss her forehead and hand over gifts. Designer handbags, perfume, jewelry. "You're amazing," he'd say. "I don't know what we'd do without you." I'd stand there in silence, my hands raw from scrubbing floors, my homework untouched, watching the charade unfold. And every time I caught Kelsey smirking at me behind her phone, I realized the same painful truth. No one was going to save me. I'd stand there, my hands raw from scrubbing, homework unfinished, watching the charade unfold. And when I caught Kelsey smirking at me behind her phone, I knew no one was going to save me. No one even saw me. Caleb spent his days gaming, Kelsey scrolled on her phone, and I did all the work. Dishes, laundry, mopping, the list was endless. It didn't matter if I had exams coming up or if I was exhausted after school. I had to be the one to keep the house running because, according to Sandra, someone had to step up. One night, after Sandra went to bed, I decided I had enough. I found Kelsey sprawled across the couch, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone with a lazy smile on her face. My blood boiled just looking at her. "Why don't you ever help?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. She looked up at me with a smirk, as if she had been waiting for me to finally snap. "Because no one notices you," she said simply. "Dad only sees Sandra. You're invisible, Leah." I swallowed the lump in my throat, her words hitting harder than they should have. The worst part? She was right. Every time Dad came home, Sandra played the exhausted stepmom, sighing dramatically about how hard it was to manage everything alone. Dad, oblivious, showered her with gifts, designer handbags, perfume, jewelry. I could have collapsed in front of him from sheer exhaustion, and he still wouldn't have noticed. By my senior year, I couldn't take it anymore. The resentment festered inside me like a wound that refused to heal. Then, one evening at dinner, Sandra folded her hands neatly on the table and smiled. That fake, practiced smile that always meant she was about to do something cruel. "Now that you're 18, she said sweetly, "you need to pay rent. $500 a month." I nearly choked on my food. "I'm still in high school," she shrugged, completely unfazed. "We can't afford freeloaders." Caleb and Kelsey both snickered, like this was some great joke at my expense. I clenched my fists under the table. So Caleb, who plays video games all day, doesn't pay. Kelsey, who does nothing, doesn't pay. But I do. Sandra's smile didn't falter. "My kids are getting established." A strange calm settled over me, a cold kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. "Well, I won't be paying rent." Sandra's expression hardened. "Oh, you will. This is my house. My rules." I met her gaze, unwavering. "No, it's my house." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Sandra blinked, then laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. "That's ridiculous." I didn't flinch. "My grandparents left it to me before they passed. It's legally mine." Sandra's face twitched, but she recovered quickly, pulling out her phone. "We'll see about that." She pressed Dad's number and put him on speaker. The line rang twice before he picked up, his voice groggy. "Sandra? What's going on?" Sandra's voice turned sharp. "Lee's claiming the house is hers. That's not true, right?" A long pause, the kind that stretched too long, filled with something that felt like guilt. Then Dad sighed heavily. "Actually, it's true." The blood drained from Sandra's face. "Not important?" she shrieked. I watched as she gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Caleb and Kelsey sat frozen, their expressions a mix of confusion and shock. Sandra hung up abruptly, slamming the phone onto the table so hard I thought it might crack. She turned to me, her eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "Well," she said, forcing a tight smile, "that was a misunderstanding. You don't need to pay rent, Leah." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, unblinking, letting the weight of the truth settle in the air. She wasn't giving up that easily. I could see it in the way her fingers twitched, in the way her jaw clenched. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that this wasn't over. And sure enough, as I listened through the paper-thin walls, I heard Sandra whispering to Dad on the phone. "David, you need to do something. She can't stay here." My stomach clenched. Dad hesitated. "Sandra, it's her house." Sandra's voice dropped to a low, syrupy tone, the same one she used when she wanted something. "I know, honey, but she doesn't belong here anymore. She's becoming a problem." My fists tightened around the sheets. Dad exhaled loudly. "What do you want me to do?" "Convince her to go away for college," Sandra said smoothly. "Out of state. Get her out of the house. She's 18 now. It's time for her to move on." There was a pause. Then Dad muttered, "Maybe you're right." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. They wanted me gone. My own father wanted me gone. The next morning at breakfast, Sandra acted as if nothing had happened. She poured herself coffee, chatted with Caleb and Kelsey, all smiles. But I knew better now. She wasn't going to stop until she pushed me out of my own home. But she underestimated me. I had a plan, and I was going to win. Sandra forced a tight smile. "Well, that was a misunderstanding. You don't need to pay rent, Leah." I didn't respond. I knew she wouldn't give up that easily. Her smile was too forced, her eyes too calculating. She wasn't backing down. She was just regrouping. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard hushed voices coming from the hallway. I shifted silently, creeping closer to my bedroom door, straining to hear. "David, you need to do something. She can't stay here." Sandra's voice was low, but urgent. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the door. "She's becoming a problem," she whispered. "She doesn't fit in here anymore. We need to convince her to go to an out-of-state college. It's for the best." My stomach clenched as silence filled the air. I willed my father to say something, anything, to defend me, to tell her she was wrong. But all I heard was a hesitant sigh. "Maybe you're right," he finally said. My chest tightened. My own father was willing to push me out of my home, just to keep Sandra happy. I clenched my fists. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to do better than that. The next morning, Sandra acted like nothing had happened. She greeted me with her usual fake cheeriness, pouring coffee, smiling like a perfect homemaker. But I knew better now. She wanted a fight? Fine. She was about to get one. I set my fork down with deliberate slowness. "Starting next month," I said, my voice calm but firm, "everyone pays rent. $500 each." Sandra froze mid-bite. Caleb, half awake, dropped his phone into his cereal with a splash. Kelsey's spoon clattered against the table. "Excuse me?" Sandra's voice was sharp, her smile now completely gone. I smiled back, sweet and unapologetic. "We're all adults, right? Seems fair." Sandra's face darkened. "Family doesn't charge family rent." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny. You said the opposite yesterday." She slammed her coffee cup down so hard the liquid spilled onto the table. "That was different. I was teaching you responsibility." I let out a dry laugh. "That's rich coming from someone living rent-free in my house." Caleb, ever the golden boy, shot up from his seat, knocking over his chair in the process. "Listen here." "No, you listen." I cut him off, standing up as well. "You've been out of college for 2 years and still don't have a job. I've been buying groceries with my own money. Maybe it's time you learned responsibility." I turned to Kelsey, who was still sitting there, frozen. "When was the last time you even did your own laundry?" Sandra's voice shook with rage. "You're just a bitter little girl jealous of my kids." I met her glare with steel in my eyes.
No, Sandra.
I'm finally standing up for myself. Her chair screeched as she shot up from the table. "Caleb, Kelsey, pack your things. We're leaving." They didn't hesitate. For once, they had no words, no sarcastic comments, no smug glances. An hour later, I stood in the doorway, watching as they stormed out, suitcases in hand. Sandra's face was twisted in fury, but beneath it, I saw something else, shock. She hadn't expected this. Neither had I. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I walked through the now quiet rooms, my fingers trailing along the furniture, no longer feeling like a stranger in my own home. The peace didn't last. As the sun began to set, my phone buzzed. Dad. I hesitated before answering. What the hell did you do? His voice was cold, angrier than I'd ever heard it. Sandra said you kicked them out. How could you be so cruel? A bitter laugh escaped me. Cruel? That's rich coming from someone who was planning to push me out of my own home. Silence. Then a slow, measured breath. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me, Dad. I heard you. Last night. I heard everything. Sandra told you to get rid of me, and you agreed. The line went dead silent. I could almost hear his thoughts racing. Then, a quiet, weak. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. I snapped. You chose her over me. You always do. Another long pause. Then his voice hardened. You're tearing this family apart. Sandra is devastated. She's threatening to leave unless you apologize. Something inside me snapped. Then let her leave.
No, Dad.
My voice was steadier than I expected. I'm done. You made your choice. Now, I'm making mine. I hung up before he could say another word. For the first time in years, I felt truly, completely free. The next day, Dad called, furious. Sandra said you kicked them out. How could you be so cruel? Something inside me snapped. Cruel? Where was this concern when Sandra tried to charge me rent in my own house? Silence. Then, a week. What are you talking about? Don't lie. I heard you on the phone with her. Dad sighed. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. Sandra wanted me gone and you agreed. After everything I've done, you chose her over me. Another long silence. Then his voice hardened. You're tearing this family apart. Sandra's threatening to leave unless you apologize. I looked around the house. Almost every picture was of Sandra, Caleb, and Kelsey. Only one tiny photo of Mom remained, half hidden behind a plant. The sight of it made my chest tighten. How had she faded so easily from our lives? I'm not apologizing, Dad. The line went dead. Graduation came and went. Sandra, Dad, Caleb, and Kelsey never showed up. My best friend's family took me in, hugged me tight, and celebrated me. They made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't disposable. Days later, I sorted through my college acceptance letters. I'd gotten into several schools, but one stood out, Northwest University. 1,000 miles away. It was time to go. I was packing for college when I saw Dad's car pull in. My stomach clenched, but I kept folding my clothes. The front door opened, and heavy footsteps echoed through the house. I turned to see them standing there. Dad, Sandra, Caleb, and Kelsey, all dressed like they were heading to a business meeting. Their expressions were cold, distant. We've come to resolve this, Dad said stiffly, with Sandra nodding behind him. I'm willing to forgive your behavior. We can move back in. But you need to apologize and drop this rent nonsense. I looked at them. Sandra's smug smile, Caleb and Kelsey sneering. Years of being treated like a maid flashed through my mind. The nights spent scrubbing floors while they watched TV. The way Sandra would complain about how hard managing the house was while I did all the work. The way Dad had chosen them over me time and time again. I straightened.
No.
Dad's face hardened. If you can't be part of this family, I'm done. I'm leaving, and I'm disowning you. I exhaled, my heart steady. That's your choice, Dad. You've been choosing them over me for years. Why stop now? Sandra gasped, hand on her chest like I had physically struck her. You've always been jealous of my children. I felt a cold smile tug at my lips. Jealous? No, but I finally see you all for who you really are. And I don't want any part of it. Dad's jaw clenched. You'll regret this. I won't. Sandra scoffed. Come on, David. We're done here. Let's leave her to her pathetic little life. Caleb and Kelsey smirked as they turned to go. But I didn't care anymore. As the front door slammed behind them, the house felt lighter, emptier. But for the first time, that felt like a good thing. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Then I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door, toward a future that didn't include them. I held up my phone. One more word, and I'm calling the police for harassment. Silence. For the first time, they had nothing to say. Sandra's face twisted with fury, but she wasn't in control anymore. Caleb and Kelsey exchanged glances, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Dad? He just stood there, shoulders slumped, like a man who finally realized he'd lost something he could never get back. They packed and left without another word. It's been 3 months. I'm writing this from my dorm at Northwestern University, 1,000 miles away, finally free. My house, is rented out to a young family. I visited once before I left for college, just to make sure everything was in order. The walls had fresh paint, the floors were polished, and the place no longer carried the weight of old memories. I could hear a child laughing from the backyard, and for the first time in years, the house felt like a home again. The rent covers my college expenses, so I don't have to worry about money. I have a scholarship too, but knowing I have financial security is a comfort I never thought I'd have. Dad? He's still working, living in a rented apartment. The last I heard, Sandra got her kitchen renovation, just not in my house. Caleb finally got a job but still lives with Dad. And Kelsey dropped out of college to start a fashion blog. They've moved on, and so have I. Sometimes, late at night, I scroll through old photos. One always catches my eye. Me and Dad on the front porch when I was 4. Him holding me up so I could ring the doorbell. He was smiling. A real, warm smile. The kind of smile that made me feel safe. I don't recognize that man anymore. Maybe one day he'll regret his choices. Maybe he'll see me as his daughter, not a burden. Maybe he'll realize that by choosing Sandra, he lost me forever. Or maybe he won't. Either way, I'm done waiting. Letting go isn't weakness, it's strength. And for the first time in my life, I'm finally strong enough to move forward. The past doesn't define me. I do.